Hello, everybody. This is Dave Farnsworth at RAP. I'm glad you could join us today. As you sign on here, feel free to introduce yourselves to each other in the chat. What I'd like to do is just go through the agenda and get us rolling. As I'm sure you're used to by now, please make a point of muting your line so we don't hear you, unless you want to speak up, of course. To do that, raise your hand or put your questions that you have or comments in the chat. Do our best to get to all of those. I think you probably have gotten a notice that we're recording this when you signed on. So I just wanted you all to know that. So let's just take a look at today's agenda. This meeting is going to be a couple hours and we're going to break it into 3 pieces. Part 1 is going to be an opportunity for us to share with you all what we think we've learned over this last period, talking with you all separately, engaging in these calls, and hearing from experts. It's a chance to take stock. And not only will we be discussing some of the things we think are fairly evident here, we're going to also point out some of the things, issues that we think still need to be determined and still need more clarification. That's the first third of this. It's going to run about a half hour or so. Then we're going to hear from Neil Fisher from NorthBridge. He's going to put up a decision tree that we think will be useful for discussing different puts and takes associated with attributional accounting. And then we'll have a discussion after that. And about 10 after 2, in about an hour, what we'll do is take a 10-minute break, give you all a little bit of time. And then we're going to come back in part 3. We're going to be discussing regulatory environments. We've been talking generically about these issues, but in fact, they're going to roll out as we put together a tariff or terms and conditions of service agreements. They're going to roll out in different regulatory contexts. And what we'd like to do is talk about that a little bit. And we're going to be using a feature called Jamboard, which will allow you folks to weigh in and to share your reactions to the discussion in that part 3. And then with a wrap up and some quick next steps, we'll close out at the top of the hour near 3 o'clock. So maybe next slide, please, Donna. I just wanted to put this up there to refresh your memory. This is how we're defining 24/7. The whole point is to match electricity demand, hour by hour, carbon-free generation within the same grid or region of the buyer's operations. Next slide, please. Our larger projects goals are to advance what we think are going to be best practices for the development of model tariffs or terms and conditions of retail service that will support 24/7 CFE procurement. Next slide. And of course, this is not a target that's standing still. Everything's in motion here. So we're in transition and we recognize that. And oftentimes it's a big challenge to clarify some of these terms, but we recognize what our goal is, of course. But we also recognize that we're working with existing systems. You have to start somewhere, and we start with where folks are. That's how we try to do things here. Not all tracking systems track anything beyond renewables, like carbon-free energy or fossil resources. Not all RTOs or utilities are inclined to make available customer load data, these basic streams of information that we're trying to match up to facilitate 24/7. So that's the larger framework, and I'm going to hand it off to Nancy Seidman to carry on the discussion from here. But it's great to have you all with us, and Mike is yours, Nancy.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I'm Nancy Seidman. I'm a senior advisor at RAP, and it's wonderful that we have so many folks interested in this topic. I'm going to walk through 6 slides with some other points that we at RAP feel are important and include our preference for each of these points. And then when I'm finished, as Dave mentioned, we have time for a discussion. We want to hear your reactions, your comments, your thoughts, either in the chat or we'll have time for folks to raise their hand and actually come on the screen. So first up is load data. And it seems to us that a utility is required to provide customer load data or some reasonable proximity for that load. And so we're interested in whether you agree with this and your thoughts, and that will go for all the slides that come up. Next slide, please. Along with load data, of course, we need emissions data. And in this project, we've been assuming that we're going to be talking about attributional accounting because, again, as Dave mentioned, this project is about a 24/7 tariff. And we need to know what can be counted towards, or if you will, attributed to a customer's load. And 24/7 CFE procurement, we feel, is more easily based on attributional accounting rather than market-based accounting, which would need some kind of capacity expansion modeling. We also feel that attributional accounting could be scaled more easily and be more accessible. But again, we're interested in your thoughts. Next slide, please. So along with emissions accounting, we wanted to reference our preference for emissions data hierarchy. You've heard about this from Neil and from Killian and from Greg and others in our prior workshops. So our preference is that people use EPA's Clean Air Markets Division data that's based on continuous emission monitors. We recognize that that applies to units greater than 25 megawatts. So in case data like that is not available, you can use a unit's heat rate and their fuel type. In the case of this kind of data, oh, what did I say, Dave? I'm sorry, consequential accounting. Thank you, Dave. So emissions data as well as fuel type data is all public information. Unit heat rates are not, but if there's some kind of time lag in when it's released, we feel that's appropriate. And otherwise, there's emission factors through various other systems, which are more conservative. And we feel that we're trying to encourage people to step up and offer both load data and emissions data. So we want to make sure people are using the best data that's available. And if neither of the first two are available, we want to be sure we're using a conservative factor to encourage people to use better data. Next up. Thank you. So my third point is sort of our third point is about the type of system we'd really like to see all over the place. And again, we've talked about these in the other meetings. We want an hourly all generation tracking system. So we want hourly certificates that are tracking all generation, carbon free and non-carbon free. We want that matched to the load that a user or generator is providing. And we added a point here about the role of all of us in terms of helping develop and ensure that these systems meet the appropriate benchmarks. This and us includes all of the users, folks like RAP who are working on policy, the utilities, the RTOs, the commissions, environmental regulators for that matter. All of us who are interested in this process have a role. And again, we'd like your thoughts on that. But to go with that hourly tracking system that I just talked about, here's the specific example of the Entergy Arkansas, I guess I could call it a tariff, I believe. So they are using, and we wanted to give you sort of an example of how we see systems evolving. So MRETS is their system. They've taken a step with Entergy that we'd like to see others take. They're using an existing REC tracking system, but they're matching that with the load from Entergy Arkansas that they're supplying to the US government. And currently they're at about 70% carbon-free electricity, 30% non-carbon free, which is what their load basically represents. So they are taking, if you will, the equivalent of certificates that match their load and their portion, appropriate portion of their carbon-free electricity. So now then their goal is to figure out how to get that remaining 30% in non-carbon free electricity. And I think my next slide is our last point. And this is something we thought we should discuss a bit today, and also will be highlighted in the presentation Neil's going to give in a little while. If we do not have an hourly tracking system, should we, RAP, meaning in the tariff, have some kind of secondary standard? As our first bullet points out, or as our first bullet points out, should we be requiring hourly tracking in the tariffs that we establish? But if we don't have that, is there a reasonable process for, say, sub-allocating from monthly or even quarterly certificates to represent carbon-free electricity? And with that, I think our next slide says discussion. And so with that, we're on to your questions and comments and thoughts. We can go to things people put in the chat. I haven't been able to monitor that while I'm talking. Or people should feel free to raise their hand and chime in. Dave, unless there's something you want to add, or Jess.
No, you've got it. Please, folks, questions, raise your hand or put questions in the chat. Questions or comments? Killian.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so thanks. Great points. I think super clear. Just one comment on the last slide. I think it might be, to require hourly certificates from day one. While I think that would be a very good signal for movement, it might not be possible everywhere. So I think we need a kind of a leverage mechanism that really strongly encourages registries to move that way, like Emirates. Potentially, if the local registry is not using or not issuing hourly certificates, you could look to an alternative like Emirates, for example, in those regions, or else, okay, I think Neil's going to talk about that in a bit, potentially have, a worst case scenario option so that folks can still get a 24/7 tariff, even if the recs aren't available. And maybe to have this time bound or something for X number of years, I'm not sure, but I think a kind of a clear direction is needed, but it shouldn't be probably, if there's no certificates, then forget the tariff altogether.
Thanks, Neil.
Thanks.
Other questions?
Dave, I saw in the chat somebody asked, what did I mean by sub-allocating? And that's a good question. What I meant was some kind of apportionment. Well, I'm interested in ideas, but to me, sub-allocating means some kind of apportionment based on folks' load and what they feel they can attribute is their portion of carbon-free electricity. Obviously, if you're going from monthly to hourly, you need a certain number of hours in a month. What ways are there to attribute certain carbon-free electricity to a certain buyer, utility, someone who wants to claim carbon-free electricity? I hope that helps the question. From Todd. It was from Todd. Yep.
Sean Bennett.
Hi, great set of principles. I think they are clear and high level and help establish a framework. Apologies if I missed this when you were articulating these principles, but one thing that we've noticed in engaging with suppliers particularly when you're thinking about the existing carbon-free electricity on the grid, is that they're willing to kind of offer you what you want. For example, if you want 100% 24/7 nuclear from their assets, they're willing to give you that. And so it was important for us, particularly when we were talking with Energy Arkansas, that we were limiting the credit we were taking for the CFE on the grid based on our load ratio share of our procurement of those assets. And so apologies that was listed, but it's just an important principle I think that we've been trying to articulate and emphasize in our engagement with other suppliers over.
Yeah, you're right. I was trying to say that, but I'm not sure we put it in the slides. That's helpful.
There's a question from Mike Hogan. In what ways is it necessary for a utility to provide customer load data, and to whom?
I think, Dave, I'll start, but you please chime in. I mean, to my mind, if someone's trying to claim carbon-free electricity, the utility is responsible for providing the data that would be needed to document that. As Sean was just saying, if you have a certain number of hours of nuclear that somebody wants to claim, or a certain amount of hydro, or a certain amount of wind, or a certain amount of solar, how is that data available? Is it available? And if not,
But I mean,
make that available.
but wouldn't you just be providing that to the customer? Why would there be a problem with providing the customer's load data to the customer?
I don't think there is. If I implied that, what we have heard in some of the other workshops, Mike, is that some systems, and maybe because customers are not asking, but it's the RTOs or it's the tracking system managers, if you will, that data is not always available. I don't know, Dave, what else would you?
No, I think that's right. The conclusion that we reach is that in whatever regulatory context, the retail provider has that information in hand and should be able to share that with a customer that wants to take advantage of a 24/7 tariff. Where that's not possible, it's very likely that I think in some cases the utility can do a next best sort of solution, which would be to model load shape for the customer and use that as the basis for matching hourly emissions data. Ian?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm with National Grid. So, we're in the Northeast and operate within ISO, New England, and NISO. I think the way customer load assets are assigned within ISO New England, it differs from NISO somewhat, but I'll just talk about ISO New England, that a competitive supplier that is taking on that and delivering that for that customer has responsibility for that load and meeting that customer's load in that load zone. Although I don't know the frequency of the meter reporting to them aside from monthly. As we go to AMI and have more granular data for all customers, not just the largest customers, where we have interval meters today, that meter reporting, we're going through that process right now in terms of developing how that will work with competitive suppliers and how they will be able to offer both shaped time varying rate and critical peak type plans for supply to customers, as well as potentially this kind of a product. So I think we're getting there, but we're definitely not there until we have AMI in this region. And as the utility providing polar or basic service, there's a lot of questions around the reform of basic service in Massachusetts, as well as mass market supply in New York, that will take a while, I think, to work out in terms of whether we'd even be allowed to offer a carbon-free product, because it would be seen as either subsidized or anti-competitive or a variety of other issues. So even if ISO New England's GIS system can account for all of it, we can do the sub-allocation and say, oh, you're 65% carbon-free on basic service today, and our goal is to have 85% carbon-free in 2040 and 100% in 2050. We can do that kind of reporting, but if somebody wants 100% today, they'll probably have to go to a competitive supplier to do it because we're not allowed to do that. So I just wanted to throw a few regional specifics out at you. And I know RAP is in New England as well, but some of you are located in New England. So you're more familiar maybe with the region than maybe some others, but it's a very different animal for us in a non-vertically integrated consumer choice business environment for the utility.
Ian, thanks so much for that. Those clarifications, really helpful. Can you tell me what percentage of in Grid's territory in New York and the rest of New England you have your customers have AMI?
I think we're rolling it out in New York currently, so it's not functional yet. But we're in the midst of beginning that meter deployment process. And then in Massachusetts, we just received approval at the end of last year for that program. So we're gearing up to start that rollout within, I think, a year. And it'll take several years to get that fully functional. So we're not anticipating having AMI in Massachusetts fully functional and rate integrated and billing integrated until 2028, I think, maybe 2029.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Greg Miller.
Yeah, just to I had two questions about the principles, but just to follow up on that point, I had recently been looking at EIA 861 data about meter deployment, and I think the number that I saw is that approximately 2/3 of all meters in the US are currently AMI, I think as of 2021. So I can go back and look at that, but I believe 2/3 is about the number nationally right now. The other questions I had about the principles is, one, should there be a principle about the locational matching of resources in the tariff? I know that some of the definitions that we've looked at for 24/7 in the past include both a time matching and location matching component. I'm wondering to what extent that should be included in these principles for a tariff. And then the other question was just about, and I think maybe this is echoing Sean's point earlier, but like, to what extent should resources be, new or additional versus existing resources? Like, should a 24/7 tariff be able to just carve out hours from an existing nuclear fleet, or should a 24/7 tariff be geared towards like building new generation that actually matches that load profile to the extent that it can?
That's helpful. Thank you, Greg.
Yeah, both good comments. We'll consider certainly both of those.
Yeah, well, so, the definition that we had goes back to your first point about principles about locational matching. We recognize, we recognize from the renewable portfolio standard development days years and years ago, you have a deliverability requirement in many states. What does that mean precisely? That's just a tougher question, and it's a locational specific question. California's ISO is full of balancing areas. The New England ISO, New York ISO have locational, the capability of making locational distinctions. And of course, there can be imports and exports that are going to affect things too. So we appreciate that. You put that really tightly drawn knot on the table, and we look forward to thinking about how to loosen that up at some point. Thanks. Tanuj.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. First, I'll make a comment. It's fantastic to see a lot of old industry friends on this call participating in this engagement. So a couple of things. One is we do know that state RPS requirements and green tariff requirements and WRI scope 2 protocols don't always line up. And it would be nice to try to build some consistency and fungibility in those so we can stack those together. So as opposed to a specific requirement to answer some of those questions, it might be more of an indication that there's some level of encouragement when we think about what a green tariff should have, and maybe we could develop some generalized guidance about how to try to reconcile those potentially 3 different flavors, or have the green tariff, line up with WRI and with state regulatory or legislative requirements as much as possible. And that's very much on our minds, given a couple of recent developments that are occurring in a couple of states related to this, including one that is talking about a 24/7 tariff. So maybe it's more of a general principle that could be shared. The other question I wanted to go back to, and I'm sorry if I missed this, if somebody else mentioned it, in places where there are not AMI deployed, I do believe that most utilities, maybe Ian can come back on and share National Grid's perspective, but I think most utilities have some sort of modeled load profile they use for different types of customers, right? They use that for rate setting, rate making, they use that for resource planning and the like. And so there could be, I don't know if that's the right tool to use, but there could be the primary of getting the actual data. And again, maybe there's an indication of where possible, let's use the actual data from a customer for the matching. And then where that's not possible, let's use the utility model data for that particular customer based on which rate class they're in, or using rate making principles essentially to use that. How it should follow. The modeled load profile should follow whatever the utility is using for their rate making for that rate class.
News, those comments are really helpful. I have a question, because anytime anybody engages in sort of regulatory processes like this, there of course are many similar complementary activities going on all around. You mentioned WRI, state activities. Can you talk a little bit more about the state activities that are underway?
I'll just give you some generalized examples of, we need to think about, is the green tariff going to have the same requirements for eligibility that a state RPS has? Or, to your point about deliverability, for example, that's one example of something. Or would it be done differently? WRI has a pretty loose, relatively loose compared to some state requirements. I don't know if that's exactly fair characterization. It's just a different set of requirements to count for scope 2. And so that becomes a little bit of a challenge. And then just in North Carolina, for example, there's a state law that was passed on emissions reduction, and there's some questions in a contested case right now about how to reconcile that with voluntary programs. In other states, I'm not sure how it's done when it comes to, like in RGGI states, for example, are the emissions avoided from the deployment of clean energy, how does that translate to, or how is it excluded from the markets in RGGI or the California carbon market? Those are some kind of questions I have that are related to this, but I don't want to get too much more specific than that, considering we're still trying to get our heads around the implications of it for our own purchasing.
That's great. That's really helpful. I'd point out that in the RGGI case, with a lot of help from the Center for Resource Solutions back at the design days of RGGI. I mean, RGGI started in 2009, but the design was undertaken back in 2003. There's the creation of something called a voluntary renewable energy set aside. And a set aside account was set up to afford the exchange between the deployment of voluntary renewables that couldn't be modeled and set into leveling of the cap, but happened after that. But the set aside program is some amount of RGGI allowances under the cap that are available to states when utilities come in and say, we sold this much voluntary renewable energy last time, we've retired here, the RECs we've retired, can you retire a commensurate amount of RGGI allowances, carbon allowances to match up? So there's that exchange program, and out of the 10 or so RGGI states, I think 8 or 9 have that set aside mechanism. So that's already been set up, and I think it'll be a potentially a really useful model to build on as we go forward with this. But thanks for those comments. Toby.
Hey there. Yeah, Toby here from Granular Energy. I just wanted to echo Tanuja's comment about alignment between RPS standards and carbon accounting standards for Scope 2. We help utilities on both sides of the pond with software to manage their RECs, both on an annual basis and an hourly basis, so they can create 24/7 products and calculate carbon emissions and so on. And definitely one of the things, speaking to US utilities, and we find quite big regional disparities depending on where that is alignment on whether or not essentially compliance recs can be assigned to end customers for their own reporting, and that becomes particularly complex when those customers are interested in their level of CFE, their level of hourly matching. And I think it would be great to have some, in some places we find that, compliance recs are considered for the utility and not to be used for voluntary reporting purposes. Other places, they're just, they can be, our view is that, recs should always be assigned to load. If everyone has paid for those recs as part of a default service, then they should be apportioned, equally and fairly among all of the ratepayers. But there should be a process of assigning recs to load, because ultimately it's consumers who consume energy, not the LSEs. But it's a debate I think would be really worth having, and will become really important in the design of these tariffs as well. It doesn't really exist in Europe because everything's voluntary and they don't really have RPS standards, but it's definitely something we've noticed in the utilities that we work with.
That's very helpful, Toby. Thank you. Always good to have other examples to reference. Do we have other? I don't think we have other hands raised. We have a couple more minutes if there's other folks who would like to chime in. Greg Miller, thank you for reminding us of NREL's end use load profile database. That's a great resource, and I know many people have used it for different parts of these discussions and others. I'm looking through the chat, so if there's others who have
yeah, please feel free to speak up, make any observations you like, questions.
Yeah.
It's not bad to be ahead of schedule. That's where we find ourselves. Great.
Yeah, Greg.
I guess just one other point is we've been talking about on the load side using kind of representative load profiles where, like AMI hourly data does not exist. I guess another question in that same vein is, could that be an acceptable method if you have like a monthly rec for kind of like allocating it to load on an hourly basis, like use a representative hourly profile or at the actual hourly generation profile from that resource and use that to kind of like distribute that 1 megawatt hour across the entire month on an hourly basis, perhaps. Again, only where that hourly generation or granular certificate data does not exist.
Right. Right. No, that's helpful for us to be thinking about other models. Ideally, as we've said, we'd have all these great tracking systems, but in the absence of those, how much do we try to push the systems versus how much do we acknowledge that we're not there yet and we're in a transition, as we said earlier, and accommodate in some respects to not having the data that we'd like to have.
Well, Nancy, I think we can move on
Yeah,
to the next
great.
session.
Some
Thank
great
you so much.
comments. Very helpful, folks. Thank you.
Thank you all. So next up, hear from Neil Fisher. And Neil, the mic is yours.
I am Neil Fisher. I'm a partner at the NorthBridge Group, and it is great I think this is a great conversation. This is really important, and it's great to see so many friends on this call. And I really just have 2 slides to share here. And these are really intended to generate discussion, and they're been prepared from the perspective of a U.S. utility interested in offering hourly attributional accounting, attributional tariff for a select group of customers interested in voluntary 24/7 procurement. And I'm not really suggesting that this type of accounting is needed for all customers, and recognize that there may need to be some time to more of a desired end state. You know, move to the next slide. And the first thing I just wanted to suggest differences from how this attributional hourly accounting would differ from sort of the way we think about scope 2 market-based calculations and how they're typically done today. The first is that, you know, the use of carbon-free granular certificates, GCs, would be used to substantiate hourly CFE claims, and it would include all types of CFE. And I think this kind of gets to the comments that some others have made on the call. And I think what Tanuj said was really important, and Sean, about, you know, this, you know, in terms of calculating a market-based inventory of emissions associated with purchases tied to the timing and location of consumption and inventory, that this would include non-CFE, I'm sorry, it would include, you know, looking at all kinds of CFE, whether it comes from new resources, existing CFE, mandatory programs, voluntary CFE, and it could come from renewable energy, you know, only, or it could come from non-renewable energy CFE. And if a utility wanted to give customers the option to just use new resources or use a combination of new and existing resources, that would be, you know, that is certainly possible, and there could be the flexibility to do that. But all CFE would count. CFE is CFE. And, you know, this kind of gets back to some of the comments that others have made about the importance of aligning both compliance markets, voluntary markets, rate-based generation that exists today on the system, and aligning all these things together I think is really important. And when I talk to some of the largest buyers in the world, in some of this, you know, especially the sustainable people, they hate when they get in a situation where they feel like they're paying for these mandatory programs, but they don't get to count it. And so it gets to, and they get forced into position, and it's not unreasonable in that world, if you have to pay for something, but you can't count it in terms of reducing your inventory, that it's not unreasonable for them to oppose those increases. And so it's important to align these markets so that they're not in competition with each other, but they're rather complementing each other. So I think that was an important point that a lot of you brought up. The other thing is, you know, ideally, you need hourly data to do hourly attributional accounting. And it would be great if we have consumption, supply, purchases, generation, and emissions data, if you're not, you know, covering it all with CFE attributes. I've been working on retail access implementation since before retail access. I have retail choice right now. I am a residential customer that still has a monthly meter. I don't have an AMI meter, but we've had a process, and I've been working with utilities for ever since retail access markets began, to basically take my monthly meter read and allocate it to an hourly basis. And that is used to determine the supply obligation whenever I choose a retail supplier. And so I think that's an important issue, if we're talking about things like, community aggregation for lots of residential customers that may not have AMI meters, whether we can do a 24/7 tariff that would aggregate mass market customers without AMI meters. Ideally, if we're talking large customers, we would have hourly data, hourly consumption data. And I have talked to some of the largest customers in the world who've told me that they don't have access. They're interested in doing 24/7 accounting. They have their monthly bills and monthly meter reads, but they don't have access to hourly data for whatever reason. But obviously, if this is a utility offering for an hourly tariff, it would be nice if that would be substantiated with hourly consumption data. The third difference, which Greg brought up, which I think is important, is using a more granular market boundary for purchases tied to consumption. And I think people talking about 24/7 typically talk about RTO or balancing authority. I've also heard people talk about eGrid subregion, but I think you could also I can think of examples where a more granular, even more granular market boundary could be used, where it's a utility service area or even a market load zone that would take into account transmission constraints. Obviously, we talked about this before, the more granular you do it, you get into, it makes it harder and difficult to do that, but we can also talk about deliverability to that service area or that load zone. Typically, when I buy power for utilities, that power has to be delivered to a market load zone, and there's a specific quantity that gets determined and there's an hourly supply obligation. So I think utilities, at least in restructured states, are used to dealing with that. And I also would a shout out to Ian Springsteel. I think I've been involved in utility procurement default service cases where I think I think that is an issue that it will need to get addressed in restructured states about where what the role of a distribution utility in a restructured state and whether they can offer a 24/7 tariff or not is certainly a big issue in a lot of default service proceedings. The other thing is the fourth difference from accounting today, which is on an annual basis, is not to count the excess CFE above consumption in an hour. And then we'd have to talk about what are the uses for that excess CFE. Can it be used for annual matching? Could it be sold to another buyer doing hourly matching? And then we're going to talk about the emissions factors in a minute here to unspecified grid, and how we treat unspecified grid supply in a 24/7 tariff. And I think the two metrics that we're typically talk about when it comes to 24/7 procurement is the CFE score percentage and also the modified scope 2 market-based inventory, which is basically taking that whatever that non-CFE and applying an emissions factor to it. Those things get calculated on an hourly basis and could get reported on an annual basis. So there'd be one number associated with the CFE score percentage, how much of your purchases tied to the timing and location of consumption are coming from CFE resources, and then what's the inventory, emissions inventory associated with whatever is non-CFE. You want to move to the next slide? So this is, I put together this emissions factor tree. This is the first time I'm presenting it in public. It's modeled off of the way we were thinking about it in a vertically integrated utility in a 24/7 tariff in a regulated state without an all generation tracking system, but within an ISO. And I think it could apply in restructured states as well. This is a high level hierarchy. I'm sure we could dive deeper into the data resources regarding how each of these could be calculated. I know that as we think about this structure in 24, we had to think a lot about credibility. How do we substantiate environmental claims? Have to worry about double counting have to think about fairness issues. I think the issue that Sean raised about, what can we, what can we reasonably claim? What's fair for us to claim in an Entergy Arkansas service territory, for example, where there's existing nuclear? We're not talking about just shuffling all the attributes to, the few customers that are interested in 24/7, but we have to think about how does this impact all the other customers on the system, which is certainly important from a utility to think about accuracy and also just the feasibility. I can tell you that this is feasible. But so in this case, the first question we ask is, have you or your LLC purchased granular certificates for the megawatt hour in question? And if the answer is yes, and you see we're in that top green box, we've got CFE and we've got granular certificates. And this, to get to Toby's comments and a bunch of others, this could be from voluntary procurement, that's direct purchases, or it could be on your behalf that your LLC is. It could be utility non-bypassable CFE. It could be rate-based generation. It could be your share of nuclear generation in restructured states with, supported by backstop by state legislation or backstop by, utility distribution charges, which are really non-bypassable, that you've got to pay them regardless. So in that sense, they're mandatory. Or it could be an allocation of the RPS. And by including all those things and new, existing, mandatory, voluntary, and allowing them all to count and to be able to count your fair share of those attributes, you're essentially aligning all those different kinds of markets together, and they're not competing with each other. And just, in this world, we don't care whether we decarbonize the grid as a result of mandatory requirements or whether we voluntarily do it. And so all these things count. And in this world, you apply, this is the easy one. You apply a zero emissions factor. This is what you need to calculate the CFE scored percentage, at making, with the condition that it can never be over 100% in any gap in any hour. You've got attributes in Entergy or Service Arkansas. There was not a generation tracking system in place, but they are tracking those granular certificates. They created granular certificates, and they're going to be tracked and retired. And so only carbon-free granular certificates count within or delivered to the RTO or balancing authority. And in that case, I think they're actually looking at the service area, what's delivered there. And then the next, as you go down to the next level, if obviously if you had granular certificates, you notice everything else in this tree is shaded gray. So it's basically saying if you don't have the granular certificates, this is in an ideal world, but this is actually can be done today. If you don't have granular certificates that are carbon free, it's basically assumed to be fossil of some kind. If you've got granular certificates from non-CFE that you've contracted with, you would apply a plant-specific emissions factor. And I actually modified this a little bit, but it basically to use the hierarchy that Rap was talking about earlier, and we use SIMS data, for example, for a specific plant, fossil greater than 25 megawatts or higher. And then you kind of get to, well, okay, if you don't have granular certificates, what do you use? And the first question is, have you or your LLC purchased non-CFE from specific resources? And this was designed to kind of reflect the kind of hierarchy that's in the Scope 2 protocol guidance today. But basically saying if you've got specific resources that you can point to that are non-CFE, you would apply and use those emissions factors. If you don't have those, you would apply a non-CFE supplier-specific emissions factors. Then you kind of get to an hourly residual mix kind of for non-CFE, and this is for talking about fossil. This one I think is hard. Unlike all the other things that are in this table, this requires you to know something about all the other claims what's being claimed on the grid. I think it's hard to do on an hourly basis, but I know some are trying to work on and improve this. And then there's the question of what if you don't have anything? And I know it's unspecified or imports. You can use an RTO or ISO fossil emissions factor, an eGrid or non-baseload emissions factor. And the other thing I had in my version of this is that I think it might be reasonable to just assume the worst and a heat rate associated with a coal generation, basically the default being that if you don't have anything, if you can't point to a specific resource, you could have an emissions factor that represents a coal plant. And that would certainly encourage buyers and suppliers offering this kind of 24/7 tariff to try and have a more specific, more supportable resource to point to come up with a better looking emissions factor when offering this kind of product. And I think it's possible to prune some branches of this tree and simplify it. And I know that we thought about ways that it can be done. I know when you're looking at a utility LSE specific service area and it's utility and they've got a vertically integrated utility with specific resources, you know, we had to think about when implementing this kind of tariff, when you're importing power, all of, you know, basically looking at all the operating resources that are operating in that hour were being used to serve load. And so that would help essentially determine the fossil emissions factor in that hour. And then when in hours where the utility was exporting back power to the grid, then you basically had to look at which resources were being used for load versus being sold into the grid, and that you were basically building a supply stack by hour and having a decision to trade basically which resources are serving load and determining the emissions factor by hour and what's being sold into the grid. But I think this could be simplified. But you know, the basic notion is that you want to be able to have supportable, credible, and substantiate claims, and make sure that attributes are being allocated fairly in a way that customers can claim what they pay for and not claim what they don't pay for. You'll notice in here that there's nothing in here about grid CFE. In other words, CFE that's coming from the grid from unspecified resources. You're not counting that in your inventory. So today, under the current protocol, if you kind of tick down the hierarchy, sometimes grid CFE is included in the residual mix, and sometimes CFE is included in the just system average emissions factor for those hours where you don't have attributes equal to your load. And so there's nothing in this tree that really has grid CFE. So you can say that it's would be a conservative way to think about that. Let me stop there and happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Neil. All right, Matt Klaus.
Hey, Neil. I thought that was really helpful. The one thing that just caught my ear was when assigning an emissions value to unspecified or null power. I think we want to skew as close to accounting as opposed to kind of adding in incentives or kind of policy elements. So I would counsel against trying to suggest the unspecified or null power is something equivalent to coal emission factors, and try to capture a residual grid mix for that area as much as possible.
Yeah, I think that the thing that I know we've struggled with is actually calculating what that residual mix on an hourly basis is, given that we don't
Yeah.
currently track all the CFE on the system, and we certainly don't track, there's a lot of CFE right now that I would classify as sort of in rate-based generation that's not renewable, that is falling into the residual mix, that's falling into the grid average in the protocol, that is essentially socialized and given away for free, and it reduces what's required under voluntary procurement. And I guess it's a question of, that's the hard part. Whereas I think when we thought about this in the context of a utility, a specific utility service area, it was, we didn't have hourly residual mix data to look at. And so what we actually had to use was sort of an hourly average fossil from the ISO.
Mhm.
And so that, but those are the considerations, certainly.
I mean, you could start by saying, in the absence of having a better answer, we're going to use a more conservative number, but with a principle of moving towards better accounting as that data becomes available.
Yeah, if we could calculate an accurate hourly residual mix number, I'd be okay with that. And I think yeah, we want to use the best available information, and I think we all agree on that.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks.
Thank you, Matt. Todd?
Hi, thanks so much. Hi, Neil. Yeah, thank you again. So I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly, and this goes back to what you just said about, you mentioned that grid CFE is not on the tree, but are you suggesting sort of starting with hourly grid average data to determine the default delivered CFE and identify the non-CFE to match with the purchased CFE? So on that first slide, sort of what's below the load line seems to be hourly grid average data. From there, you identify a non-CFE portion, and then you move to the tree on the next slide where you're talking about matching CFE to that non-CFE portion based on hourly certificates or not. And if you don't have the hourly certificates, you use a residual mix for that. But am I correct in understanding that you're still assuming hourly grid average to start with to identify that non-CFE portion?
No, it's a great question. And I think this is a fundamental difference, that in this case, we had a vertically integrated utility with specific resources that, and so it was much more of rather than use a grid average, it was a bottom-up kind of approach where we had customers already on the system that were paying for existing rate-based generation, and they were just allocating their fair share of those resources within, that they're paying for from this particular utility. And it was a bottom-up sort of approach.
Okay, so there's no double counting in that.
Yeah,
There's no double counting in the grid CFE that you're starting with.
no,
Okay.
in fact, we didn't use grid CFE. It's all bottom up. It's basically figuring out from the customers who are on the utility tariff. The central question we were trying to answer was, what is their fair share of the grid, their baseline, if you will, the CFE baseline or starting point was what's their fair share of what they're required to pay for today. And they weren't currently, under the current system, these attributes were not being claimed, they were not being retired, but they will be as a part of being participants in a 24/7 kind of hourly accounting tariff.
Thank you.
And that could apply to rate-based generation. It could apply to an RPS kind of standard that LSEs are buying RECs on behalf of the load. It could apply to nuclear life extensions in the states, in restructured states. But it's basically trying to figure out what is the fair share of those required purchases starting point. So like Toby was saying, and I think others have said on the call, trying to figure out what's the right starting point for doing this kind of accounting. And it doesn't, it's trying to figure out what percentage of your purchases tied to the timing and location of your consumption are carbon free. And if you're not matching that, and it's a bottom-up kind of analysis, and if you're not matching it, if for the hours where you're short, what's the best available information we have to figure out what are the emissions factors associated with that non-CFE supply to that customer.
Okay, so yeah, it could be, it seems like the broader challenge is to identify what the best data is for that. So if you have hourly utility specific default generation data, then or you could use an hourly residual mix if you had something like that, assuming that you could figure out the boundaries. And the general conversation is about how to get the best data for that number.
Yeah, we did have hourly generation data, and the utility was able to give provide hourly consumption data too.
Okay, all right.
Other questions for Neil? Well, we're waiting for someone to come in. Neil, I have a question for you. Back on your first slide, you've shown that slide before, really interesting, where in the middle of the day you have overproduction of renewables, right? All those yellow bars that go up above the load line. You touched on it briefly here, but I think it would be interesting to just think about this a little bit more. You mentioned some of the things one might do with that extra production. Batteries, picking it up with batteries. Maybe this is just a wish list sort of thing, but it seems to me that this is one of the things that Jesse Jenkins is talking about, where you have a spot market where those things could be commoditized, put into certificates, and then traded for folks who haven't got the production, but who need to fill in those types of certificates to match load at the right times. Am I on the right track here?
Yeah, I think there are people thinking about, having these hourly attributes be tradable, mechanism, create a market. I mean, just like electricity is bought and sold today, and that can be exchanged. And I know that there are blockchain companies that are actually working on that. And so that if you had excess, I think this is important too, because if you have excess supply that you as an individual customer don't need, and you could sell that to somebody, it's a way of aggregating, and doing this on a much more aggregated basis, and that people could buy and sell and exchange excesses or deficits. And it's a way of just doing ultimately I care about decarbonizing the grid and the system load, not like 2 or 3 customers and matching individual customers' load. I care about getting and driving towards decarbonization, and I think there are efficiencies, and it would lower the overall cost of doing this is if we could pool loads and do this on a more of a system basis. So I think that would actually help, and I see that's where this market going in the future.
Greg.
And just following up on that point, one of the things that we've been looking at is with that, with that excess generation from a 24/7 tariff, the utility might have other tariffs that are traditional, annually matched, whatever, green programs or just standard delivery customers. And the part of the question becomes like, does some of those excess, does that excess generation then just get reallocated to other tariffs within the utilities portfolio? And if so, like, is there any compensation to the 24/7 tariff customers for that, or is it just kind of, how does it get allocated across the entire utility tariff portfolio?
Yeah,
So
and I think the beauty of this is that, we had to figure out like what the allocated share and the fair share of attributes was to the customers participating on this tariff. but we didn't really have to, and we had to think about what are the impacts on all the other customers of the system, but we really didn't have to like know what the claims of everybody else on the system were, what those were, or we didn't have to do this hourly accounting for really all the other customers. It was really just trying to figure out the share and do this accounting for the customers participating in this program. But I do think there is a really interesting issue about, and with RECs, those things can be bought and sold and traded today on compliance markets. But I think there's a really interesting question about what happens to those attributes for like non-bypassable utility CFE, like rate-based generation. If they don't buy, if those, right now, think of all the customers, residential customers, small C&I customers in Energy Service Arkansas service territory. They're essentially purchasing that nuclear generation. And what happens to it if they don't track and claim it today? Well, it's in the grid CFE, it's in the residual mix if there was a residual mix being used in inventory accounting. But do we even really want them to sell it to Google or the government and just reshuffle those attributes and give it to the few customers that are doing 24/7? I don't think so. I think that the way I view it is that if somebody is doing voluntary procurement, in like a 24/7 tariff, it should be in addition to, and by addition to, I mean regulatory addition. It should be in addition to what's already being required, either under an RPS or as a part of utility non-bypassable CFE. And so making sure that those attributes are not just shifted or reshuffled to the few customers doing this 24/7 procurement. But that's not an issue that I don't think a lot of people are talking about yet. But I think Tanuj and Sean had to think about that, like, when they were, if Energy Service Arkansas said, oh, we'll give you a 24/7 tariff, we'll just give you all these nuclear attributes that we already have, they're not being used, we'll just give them to you so you can, look good. And I don't think that's not what I know Tanuj wanted, and I'm sure he's going to chime in here. So go ahead.
I'll just confirm. Sorry, Babe. I was just going to confirm what Neil said, and we did address that, and have in the implementing instructions that are published at sustainability.gov have a framework that was used to try to set that up. And can offer some more clarification here in a little bit if that's helpful. But that is the approach we did as an accurate description by Neil.
Thank you. So, folks, we've gotten to a point in the agenda where we're gonna take a little break. I want to first thank Neil. Neil, you make drinking from a fire hose pleasant. It's very nice, and this was a good presentation. Thank you so much. So we're gonna take about 10 minutes. We'll come back at 2:23, and then Jess Shipley is gonna pick up the string and move along. So we'll see you in about 10 minutes. Hi, everybody. We're back and ready to get started. Thanks for sticking with us here. As I mentioned earlier on, we want to look at different regulatory environments and discuss those. We've been talking about these topics in general terms a little bit, getting into specifics today, of course, but what we'd like to do is take some time to talk about different regulatory environments. And to do that, I'm going to hand off the discussion to Jessica Shipley.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Yeah, so we've talked about this already a bit, and certainly it's been alluded to by Neil that these tariffs are going to roll out in different regulatory contexts. And this is something that we as RAP are going to have to sort of be grappling with as we develop sample or model tariffs or contract language guidance as we move into the next phase of this overall project. And we're planning to develop a few different options that reflect the circumstances in different regulatory environments These scenarios that are shown on the screen are tentatively how we're thinking about differentiating those regulatory environments currently. So we're looking to get your input into what is important in those environments when it comes to emissions and characterizing CFE. So just to say what they are, a vertically integrated utility company, retail utilities and fully restructured markets, and then a hybrid of the two where a vertically integrated company might be operating in a restructured market or where third-party generators are connected to the bulk system. So we're not necessarily, I just want to say, we're not necessarily assuming that everything would be different and that many aspects of the decision tree, for example, that Neil shared may actually be the same in all of these contexts, but we want to make sure we're thinking through the relevant differences for purposes of developing those sample tariffs or contract term guidance that we'll be working on in the next phase of the project. So we're hoping that you all would be willing to share some views with us on what is particularly relevant for characterizing CFE or emissions in these different regulatory environments. So to do that, we rather than just raise hands for this part of the agenda, we're going to use a tool called Jamboard, which is something that you'll all be able to edit and sort of input your thoughts. In the chat, I'm going to put the key question that you'll see at the top of the Jamboard, which is what is particularly relevant for characterizing CFE or emissions in these different regulatory contexts. On the Jamboard, there are 3 different pages, one for each of these 3 scenarios. So the next thing I'm going to put in the chat is a link to the Jamboard, which is a Google product. I'm hopeful that all of you will be able to access that. If folks cannot access Google products from your computer, what we can do is have you send individual chat messages through Zoom to myself or Dave or Nancy, and we would be happy to add your comments directly to the Jamboard for you. Just to orient you a little bit to the software, at the very top of the screen, you should see a couple of a left and a right arrow. This is how you can navigate between the 3 different pages on the Jamboard. You should see that the first page refers to the vertically integrated utility context. The second page refers to the restructured market context, and the third page refers to the hybrid context. And in order to add a sticky note, which is what we're hoping that you will do, please look at the tools along the left-hand side of the screen. The 4th icon from the top should be a little white square. That should allow you to select a sticky note. And it doesn't matter the color, feel free to use whatever color you want. And provide as short as possible an answer to the question on the board, what is particularly relevant for characterizing CFE or emissions in a vertically integrated or restructured or hybrid context. And there's just a couple of example stickies on each board to give you a sense of what we're kind of looking for here. You can stop sharing your screen, Donna. I'm going to quickly share my screen so that you all can see what the Jamboard looks like. Again, the arrows at the top here will toggle through the 3 different pages. And over here on the left-hand side, you'll find the ability to add a sticky note. Please let me know if you have any questions on how to utilize Jamboard. You can chat them to me or just come off mute. We're going to take a few minutes and just be silent and let folks add thoughts. I'm going to stop sharing. Are there any questions or other comments from RAP team on how to do this? It's okay if the sticky notes kind of overlap each other. We'll deal with the organization of it. So please feel free to just kind of drop them wherever makes sense.
Just perhaps one addition, if folks feel things are relevant for more than one page, you want to show how you can copy a sticky, right? If you click on it, right, you right click or so that folks could paste those into the others, or they could make a note in their sticky that I think this applies to all three scenarios, something like that. What do
You can copy a sticky, but you can't drag it to another board.
Oh, okay, never mind. I thought you could do that.
I recommend just repeating yourself if there's something you want to add to both, or saying this is also relevant to X scenario.
Okay.
We'll take just 1 or 2 more minutes. So just a reminder to click through to all 3 of the pages if you have anything to add to the second and third page. It looks like folks are getting to the third one now. We'll just take a couple more minutes and then we'll wrap up.
Hey, Jessica, on the third page, you describe a vertically integrated company. Is that a consumer or a utility?
Sorry, it should be a utility.
Thank you.
All right, I think we can start to talk a little bit about what we're seeing on the Jamboard. Feel free to continue adding stickies. I don't want to stifle anyone's input. We're really thankful for all the input so far. So I'm going to just, I guess, comment briefly on what I'm seeing on the vertically integrated utility context board, and then see if Dave or Nancy have any thoughts on the others, and then open it up to see if anybody has anything in particular that they might want to just articulate out loud to make sure that we understood what their sticky says, or to really make a point for the group. So I'm definitely seeing a theme around demand side data and figuring out how to kind of ensure data integrity when not all customers have AMI meters. There's a couple of stickies around protecting other customers and understanding the impact on other customers. Someone's moving the stickies around in real time. All generation tracking system and a couple other stickies around the capabilities of tracking systems. A couple of different thoughts around basically the allocation of generation to load, and sort of the data and the meter information necessary to do that. I grouped a couple of stickies together. I'm not sure if these were meant to be similar, but there's a couple of thoughts around public disclosure and sort of verification to double check that the utility is appropriately reporting emissions. I would just, I guess, highlight there's one sticky in here on storage, which is something that's come up a few times in our workshops, and definitely something we need to think about, whether there's something we need to include in the tariff specifically for that. And then there's quite a few others that are sort of individual thoughts here that don't necessarily, I think, have a theme. But Dave or Nancy, do you have a couple of thoughts from what you're seeing on your boards?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I'm in the restructured board, the second page here. Lots of really good comments. Of course, if I don't correctly characterize what we all put up there, please feel free to speak up. But I saw several remarks about the utility role and the value of standardization and coordination of retail practices across an ISO. That would be really useful. There was one interesting sticky that said it's important to understand the impacts of intermittent resources on the system. I think that's really important. And of course, there's the corollary, which is when you discuss intermittent resources, it's important to make sure you're getting the most out of the grid flexibility that's available and often not capitalized on, both demand and supply side flexibility. Regulatory or other oversight. We know that RPSs are overseen by, utility commissions in a lot of states and other regulators. Voluntary markets, the Green E program is, a regulator of sorts. They're the sheriff to keep an eye on things. So that sort of oversight was mentioned in a couple of places. Another mention of what I think of Neil's goal of allowing ratepayers to claim what they pay for and not pay for the CFE or other things that they don't claim. So this sort of fair allocation point comes across. I think it's an important point. That's what I have, Jess.
Great.
And
I
if
don't know.
we,
Yeah, Nancy, go for it.
yeah, if we go to 3, so there's some of the same things that you all have mentioned, like demand side metering and the support for an hourly tracking system, imports and exports. So it's nice to see that there is some consistency across, some things that the 3 of us felt did carry across, that you all are confirming that. That's helpful. There are 2 that if folks who wrote them, wanted to get off and explain, I think next, Jess, we were going to ask for perhaps comments from folks. Somebody's written attribution of carbon and energy traded on the market. And I'm wondering if there's a difference, if that means something different than an hourly certificate tracking carbon in an hour from a particular resource. And the other one that was of interest, a particular interest to me, was how does it work for avoided energy use? And I wasn't sure if folks meant, energy efficiency resources or demand resources. We heard that the demand side metering and using demand resources. If that's what folks are meaning, that's helpful. But if it was something else, that would be useful to hear from folks. And I see somebody just added one that's come across others, harmonization, right? Important. So that's.
Yeah, if anybody would like to chime in, we have a couple of minutes before we move to next steps. We'd love to hear from anyone who has anything in particular that they want to highlight as a key consideration or difference that RAP should be thinking about as we go forth and develop this sample tariff language guidance. Or if we characterize anything that you wrote incorrectly, please do also raise your hand or unmute.
And if you think of something after this, feel free to write to us as well.
This is Neil. One thing that I thought of in restructured states, I know when I done a lot of purchasing for distribution utilities, and they buy supply, they typically are under an obligation to purchase the least cost resources, and they don't even ask suppliers, what the emissions or what the sources are. It's just, give us this amount in this hour and whatever's cheapest on a full requirements basis. So they don't even know the supply sources or the emissions associated with the supply often. And that's most of, the restructured states operate that way. So I think that's, if we're talking about a 24/7 tariff, whether there would have to be like separate arrangements just for customers on that tariff, or how you would even think about integrating that with the full requirement service that they're typically procuring.
This is Ted Thomas. My point kind of follows on that. In the RTO, it's a big blob. They're measuring every 4 seconds. They're averaging every 15 minutes. Sometimes they report in hours. So you have to figure out what those increments are. Now I'm less concerned. I know in an earlier conversation I was concerned about gaming that. I'm less concerned about gaming it because it's so complex. It's hard to measure, much less measure with and work in a way to game it. But just the measuring of that, since it's a clearinghouse system, it's not me selling it to you, it's me offering it to anybody and then any buyer picking it up.
Right.
Thank you.
Toby?
Oh, yeah, just a flag. I think this question of, alignment between like the wholesale power markets and granular certificate markets is a really interesting topic. And once, you have granular certificates available that are based on the same metering data that's also used in the power markets, there's, potential for much closer alignment between the way these two systems work, and bundling of GCs and power becomes much more real than the today's bundling, where you can bundle a PPA with annual RECs but still have to depend on the power market and so on. We've actually, it's written slightly more in a European context, but I think it's very relevant for the competitive regions in the United States, where we've written a white paper, which some of you I think have seen, with the main power market operator in Northern Europe, essentially all about. I just put a link to it in the chat about how you can bring these two disparate systems together. I'm not going to summarize it all now, but we just summarize some of the benefits that can come from this. So yeah, just thought I'd share that.
Great, thank you. Dave, do you want to talk about next steps?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
we got one more hand up.
Go ahead, Matt.
Oh, I was just going to put a plug in for those of you who are going to Austin next week. And besides hoping that Austin Energy keeps the power on for all of those attending NARUC during this heat wave, Commissioner Anthony, who some are pointing to her piece in Utility Dive, I think we'll be talking in her follow-on panel from the winter session on tracking clean energy. We'll be kind of picking up some high-level aspects of this conversation. I don't know that she plans to get specifically into hourly, but certainly there's I think an interest there to try to find some greater harmonization among states in the US as they think about emissions accounting and energy tracking.
Thank you, Matt. I will see you in Austin, Matt. It's just not hot enough here in the Northeast. I want to go down where it's 105 degrees. We'll see you there.
Tuesday morning. Be there.
All right. Thanks. Okay, so next steps. First, I want to thank you all for sticking with us all this time. It's this is really important stuff, and it's not particularly easy, and you all are champs for sticking with us. So as you know, we want to develop sample tariffs. What we think we're going to do is develop some elements that would go into sample tariffs because of perhaps the different challenges associated with regulatory context. So coming up with elements are what we're thinking about doing. And we'd like to have your all's comments on those elements that we put together. So what we're hoping to do by the 28th of July is get something in writing out to you, not a long piece, 4 or 5 pages, something like that. We're hoping to get comments from you, several weeks after that. In the larger scheme of things, RAP is going to be having a convening of all our different work groups sometime in September. And we'll be putting all these things out at that point as well. So while we asked you in the past to save August 4, save that date for another work group meeting, we decided we're not going to have that meeting. What we're going to do is put some of this stuff down on paper and put it out for you all to kick the tires on and give us your comments on. I don't think there's anything else to discuss today. Nancy or Jess?
Just want to see if anybody has any questions on the next steps.
Does anybody have any questions on the next steps? That's
And
great.
also express my appreciation, yeah, for everybody's input. With the Jamboard, we weren't sure how the Jamboard was going to work, but it seemed like it was really helpful, and hopefully people enjoyed it, something different.
Well, great. Thank you all. Appreciate your participation. And we'll be in touch soon. Have a great afternoon. Bye now.